All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. Probably one of the last events of Infrastructure Week. I know it's been a lot for those of us in the infrastructure space, so I appreciate y'all joining us this morning. I'm Michelle Nellenbach. I'm the director of our infrastructure project here at the BPC. Welcome. We are just absolutely thrilled about today's event. It's rare that you get to interview your former boss, who's now the administrator of the EPA. So it's kind of an exciting moment for us all, for me anyway. But first, I want to introduce Alex Hergott, who many of you know is the executive director of the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council. Might need a new name there for the an associate director of CEQ and deputy staff director. He was the deputy staff director of the Senate EPW committee, and he and I also worked together years ago on the EPW committee, and he's doing great work over at the White House. So I'm going to introduce him and let him come up and make a few remarks.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Michelle. I know everyone came here to see the administrator, so I'm going to be quite brief and then take a couple questions. And then, how many of you know what the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council is? Yes, it seems like many of you have clients that come to me on a regular basis, and that seems what the case is. But doesn't it seem rational to have one single point of contact within the federal government in a process that has become fragmented and unpredictable and in many ways somewhat opaque? It's something that I remember as in my 15 years or 14 years in the Senate helping to write infrastructure bills. I always thought, you know what, it is not a Republican or a Democrat issue to have a streamlined process in which we could have a single point of contact for those putting capital at risk, and not just private sector, but mayors and governors that didn't have to come to D.C., and no offense to those in the room, to hire consultants to navigate the black box that is D.C. You know, the reality is that the average EIS still on the low side is 4.5 years, and that doesn't include the up to 56 federal authorizations that could be required post a record of decision at the end of the environmental process. I have one project on the dashboard that has 19 cooperating agencies, 7 federal, 3 state, 6 county, and 3 local entities. How do you figure that out? When you don't have a single repository, and in many cases, we were in the dark ages with the internet, forcing coordination and ensuring concurrent reviews is something that is built to fail. The system just doesn't work. One case, 30 permitting actions, 50 state and local, and could have up to 611 water crossings that require individual permits, which is why working with EPA and the administrator has been extremely important, and process redesign to bring common sense back to a process that oftentimes can be confusing and we don't know why. Which is why the Permitting Council, which was authorized in the 2015 FAST Act, which my good friend Ryan Jackson, who's in the back of the room, who's the chief of staff that works with Andrew, helped push over the finish line in coordination with Senator Boxer and my boss, Senator Inhofe, to ensure that we had something that would be serviceable and would be an outwardly facing, very simple, dynamic site so that people could actually figure out where their projects were in the process. And this is all we're doing. Tell me if you think this sounds complicated. A definitive beginning and a definitive end. Project sponsor comes to the Permitting Council. Within 60 days of being on the dashboard, we give you very simply a chart with a beginning, milestones, interim and final completion dates, and an end. Is that so complicated? Why has that been such a struggle over the years? And then if you look over here to the problem that we're trying to address, that is just not workable. And if we start treating American taxpayers like customers rather than adversaries in a system where we force them to go through that just to build a project, then what are we doing here? We're not trying to force yeses, we're just trying to force decisions. Currently, we have close to $200 billion in projects under management that spread across all sectors. More than half of our projects are renewable energy, including wind, hydro, and several others. In fact, as soon as I leave here, I'm going to get on a conference call with a solar project in Nevada to ensure that they fully understand the process and the product, because we look at these individuals and these mayors and governors as customers rather than entities. And I think what folks are beginning to realize is that the Permitting Council, which is funded north of $6 million a year, is twice the size of the Council on Environmental Quality. Our job is individual project adjudication in real time for those that have these major multi-billion-dollar projects, and all they are asking for is certainty in the process. And we have never thought that that was anything other than an apolitical, impartial third party that holds your hand and shepherds you through the process. I'm very committed to it, and I have a staff that looks through the eyes of practitioners. In the back of the room, I have Joe, who's from the head of the Tulsa district in the Corps. I have 2 Forest Service detailees, Jennifer and David. Nick Falvo from EPA. Thank you, Andrew. He's a legal advisor that keeps me out of trouble. But what we do with those resources is actually get the people from the field and operationalize it, so our documents are understandable in an 8th grade level. You don't need a PhD to understand this. You do to understand that. Demystifying the process is what we're all about, and I think that as we continue to move forward and as you see some of the negotiations on the Hill with reauthorization and the rest, folks are going to be double downing on the council as they realize that this is an asset and not anything to be afraid of. With that, I want to take a couple questions, and then I'm going to, very brief questions if anyone has, and then I'm going to bring the main event on with a very spirited introduction.
Alex, you mentioned the $6 billion budget.
Mm-hmm.
Could you comment on how that money is made available to you? Is it coming from Congress?
Yes, it comes from Congress in the Financial Services Appropriations Bill. So that both helps me to fund my office. These detailees are reimbursable agreements. So they are not on what we used to do on Capitol Hill. They're not on a non-reimbursable basis. We actually don't displace the other work that is happening in the agencies that are currently working on these projects. Many of these individuals have been the leads on EISs, have actually written these documents, and those are the ones that I rely on for the process redesign. Those agencies out in the field are not in a gap situation because they have the resources now to fill that individual, and many of them are here on 50-50 basis, where they're here 50% of the time and back in their respective district. And that's what we're going to continue to do on these 4- and 6-month details, so we can operationalize it out into the field. So this Fast 41 Permitting Council isn't just some DC one-size-fits-all process, that it's actually the new normal.
And what's your FTE, would you say, of your run this year?
We have about 4 or 5 FTEs. 5, yeah. Our goal is not to create a huge bureaucratic footprint. Our goal is to create a strong office with relevant contracting capabilities with outside resources, ICF and others, and then rely on our detailees. That's the best use of these resources. We also have the ability, under the Economy Act, to move money over to agencies to help augment agency appropriations to help them with their resource constraints. It's a very important distinction between our council and others. All right. On February 28th, the United States Senate confirmed Andrew Wheeler as the 15th, is that okay? Am I good to go? All right. Of the Environmental Protection Agency. President and my boss, Donald J. Trump, had announced his appointment as acting EPA administrator on July 5th, 2018. Mr. Wheeler had previously been confirmed by the U.S. Senate as EPA deputy administrator on April 12th. Mr. Wheeler has dedicated his career, and many don't know this, to advancing sound environmental policies and has always been a staunch environmentalist. He began his career during the George H.W. Bush administration as a special assistant at EPA's Pollution Prevention and Toxic Office. And prior to his work at one of the firms that he was at for a little bit, where he represented mostly renewable energy, which a lot of people don't realize, even though there's been comments to the otherwise. Mr. Wheeler served for 6 years as the majority staff director and chief counsel and minority staff director of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, where he hired me 15 years ago and fired me twice. Before his time at the full Senate EPW committee, Mr. Wheeler served in a similar capacity for 6 years for the Subcommittee on Clean Air, Climate Change, Wetlands, and Nuclear Safety, working with Senator Voinovich. The thing that I've got to say about Andrew before I bring him up is he's not only a consummate professional, he actually is dedicated to fixing problems. He actually knows what he's talking about. He's an Eagle Scout. He hiked Mount Kilimanjaro, and I'm proud not only to consider him a friend, but I think we should all be very fortunate that he actually leads the EPA, and I rely on him on a daily basis to help me continue to fix the problems in a rational way that recognizes that when it comes to the natural environment and human activity, that we can always find a balance, and that we can have win-win solutions on both sides. That is something that Administrator Wheeler, Andrew, has always taught me, and it's a pleasure to invite him to the stage to hear his remarks. Andrew.
Wow,
That was quite the introduction.
yeah,
wasn't it?
that's a little hard to follow.
I know. I
So,
don't know if to live up to.
yeah, I will echo what Alex said. It really, the administrator was one of the best bosses I ever had, and it was a pleasure to work for him. And I just am thrilled that you have reached this pinnacle. I think the agency is in great hands. So.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us here at EPA, at VPC, for Infrastructure Week. And we're going to talk a little bit about your role in all of that. And I wanted to follow on Alex's remarks about permitting, because in regulatory reform, the president has obviously made this priority. He would like the federal process to take 2 years and no longer. And I think for good or for bad, a lot of folks, at least outside of Washington, sort of equate EPA with a lot of that delays and the red tape and such. But you're not. What role are you playing in any of this? The regulatory piece.
On the permitting side.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, it was interesting. President Trump has set a goal for 2 years for all federal permits. My predecessor, Administrator Pruitt, came in the EPA and said he'd like all EPA permits to be done within 6 months. But the first thing we realized when we got on the ground at the EPA is that the agency was not tracking how long it took to issue a permit. So you can't improve a process unless you at least know how long the process takes. So the first thing we did was implement the lean management system at the agency to try to track how long our process takes. And we've already made improvements. Just last year, from June to November, we decreased our backlog of permits by 34%. And we're making headway every day on clearing out the backlog and processing the permits as quickly as we can.
Well, that's great. That's very consistent with what the president has advocated for, and still protecting full protection of the environment, the full review
Absolutely.
process.
When I and I visited all 10 of our regions. I've been to, I think, 4 of our labs now, and I give all hand speeches wherever I go. And I stress to all of our staff that it's not approving a permit within 6 months. It's a decision within 6 months, up or down. It's giving that certainty that if you're applying for a permit, you will get an answer within a set amount of time. I'm not telling anybody, and nobody at the agency is telling anybody, to approve all permits. It is on a permit by permit basis, but what I believe and what we believe, what the president believes, is that we need to provide the transparency and the certainty to the permittees so that they know that they can get a decision within a set amount of time.
Well, and here at BPC, our infrastructure project has largely revolved around the question of public-private partnerships and how to get more private capital aligned with public infrastructure projects. And one of the chief complaints we hear from investors in industry is that they don't know that it can take too long. They cite the example of the project that took 10 years. I think that's an anomaly, but there is still, they need that certainty in order to make those investment decisions. One other aspect of this, of the infrastructure discussion, which you have a huge role in, is obviously water infrastructure. Mm-hmm. One of my frustrations as a veteran water staffer is that you always end up in a conversation about highways. We're hoping the infrastructure bill includes water infrastructure. And I know that you have been really out there talking a great deal about water and the need for clean, safe drinking water for communities across the country and the globe.
Absolutely. We have to have water infrastructure investments. We have to continue to innovate there. We have a number of different programs where we're trying to get more money out to the communities that need it for water infrastructure. We have the new WIFIA program, which is now 2.5 years old. We've issued 8 WIFIA loans through the WIFIA program from the first year. The second year, which we're currently reviewing all the applications that we received, and we just announced the availability for the third year, and we've been very lucky to get increased appropriations from Congress on this. And this third round that we just announced, we have $6 billion available, and the deadline for applying for that is July 5th. So if you don't mind, I'm going to just do a commercial. If you have a water infrastructure project that you need help on funding, please get us a letter of intent by July 5th. We can provide up to 49% of the financing. The wonderful thing about the WIFIA program is that it provides that last bit of funding in order to get the project off the ground and to break ground. which has been the great thing about this program so far. The 8 that we've already funded, I believe they've broken ground on all 8 of those projects.
That's great.
You know, and it's just a way of providing that extra little bit of capital that the markets need in order to get these projects up and running.
Great, and I should have mentioned this at the start. You all should have note cards and pens on your chairs. So if you want to ask a question, just write your name, organization, and the question. And we have staff in the room who will be walking around to collect those. But I'm going to ask a few more first. So EPA has an Office of Water, Finance, and Resiliency that's overseeing WIFIA and doing some really great things around P3s. And so we're really excited about watching that develop. And we've been big proponents of WIFIA. I would be remiss at a Infrastructure Week event not to flag the state revolving loan funds, which
Yes.
we are huge supporters of. Believe it's a critical piece of helping communities meet their clean water and drinking water needs. The president's first budget increased them, was fantastic. The last couple, not as much, have cut them. And I do know from my experience that this is often a budget game. The SRFs make up a third of your budget. It's hard to balance a budget and leave them intact. So, but I did want to give you an opportunity to comment a little bit about the commitment to the SRFs and the role they play in all of this.
Sure, and you know, one of my regrets when I left Capitol Hill and when you left Capitol Hill is we did not get the reform bill that you spent so many hours on the RFS program through Congress. But you know, at this point, I believe it's 1.6 billion we just announced for the SRS for this year. At this point in time, there is $80 billion circulating through the SRF programs, both the clean water and drinking water SRFs. So there's a lot of money circulating through the programs. Once the money is repaid, it then goes back into new projects. And so while the appropriations levels may not seem like a lot each year, there is a tremendous amount of money in that system. What we did ask for in the President's budget for 2020 is increased funding for WIFIA, and we also asked for money for OWIA. OWIA is a new program passed by Congress last fall that we think is really going to help us with some of the small disadvantaged communities. Congress did not give us any money for OWIA for this year, but we asked for money for 2020. So this is a new program, and so while we asked for money for the SRFs, those programs are so well established, we thought it'd be important to ask for money on the OWIA side to try to get some of these new grant programs off the ground and running.
So along the lines of the small and disadvantaged systems, you know, we've got, 16,000 drinking water systems in this country, and most of them serve 10,000 and under. They're very small. They lack the ability to really disperse improvements over a wide constituent base. And so one of the issues that has come up around WIFIA, I know, is around the ability of those small systems to apply.
Yes.
And I think there's some talk about, can you get them to work together? I mean, what are you all thinking on that?
We've tried that. We've been working with some of the communities to see, you know, we don't, you know, as I said, this is just we're starting the third round. So people are still trying to learn the WIFIA system, how they can use it. We were working with a group of small communities, I believe in Indiana, to try to encourage them to pull their resources together. One of the new ones that we're working on is a public-private partnership in California for a desalinization plant.
Great.
So we can use it on the public-private partnership side too. So we're still learning on WIFIA on what we can do. We also just recently announced I'm going to get around 45 million for drinking water assistance for schools and daycares on lead and drinking water, and we also announced around the same amount for small disadvantaged communities on a separate water grant program. So, I mean, we do have items where we're trying to focus on small disadvantaged communities, you know, and we're moving forward with new regulations. We will be updating our lead and copper rule this year.
Right. You want to say a little bit more? Because we've been working a lot with folks up in Flint who have obviously been heavily impacted by the crisis. So what do you guys...
Well, this would be the first major update to the lead and copper rule in over 20 years.
Wow.
And, you know, to be honest, after I became the acting administrator last fall, the staff came to me with a draft proposal, and I actually sent it back to the water office because what I was concerned about that I didn't think we were really addressing, you know, last fall, but we are now, and this should be going over to OMB sometime in the next couple of weeks. is we have a huge backlog of water infrastructure projects around the country. It's going to take almost $1 trillion and probably 25 to 30 years to replace all of the lead and copper pipes around the country. I wanted to make sure that we were targeting those pipes that are the most corrosive first.
Okay.
I was very concerned that the more affluent communities would get the funding and be able to replace their pipes up front, but the more corrosive pipes may have to wait 29 and a half years to be replaced. So what we're doing is we're going to target through testing and monitoring and mapping of all the lead pipes as well to try to figure out where the most corrosive pipes are so that those pipes get replaced up front instead of having to wait 29 years. So I was very concerned at the first proposal I saw last fall that we didn't have a method in place of identifying the worst pipes in the country. So we're trying to do that. We're going to be taking comment, and I encourage everybody to take a look at our proposal, give us comments on if we get this right, and if any suggestions on how to better target the funding and better target the resources. But we really want to make sure that everybody in the country, regardless of their zip code, regardless of their economic status, everyone deserves clean drinking water, and we want to make sure that the people most in need get the attention first.
I'm intrigued, and you may not be this much into the weeds on it, but I'm intrigued by the idea of we're going to identify where the most corrosive are. Our experience in talking to a lot of communities is some of them don't know where the pipes are. Sure. Like the inventory of that alone is kind of daunting.
The first part of our proposal is going to be to try and inventory all of the lead and copper pipes in the country. So that would be the first part of the lead and copper rule, and then some testing and monitoring to try to figure out which pipes are most corrosive. And we do some groundbreaking research at our EPA labs. I was just at our water facility in Cincinnati about a month and a half ago, and talking to some of the researchers there, and one of them in particular had cross sections of pipes from about a dozen different communities around the country. And it's not just a matter of replacing the pipes. There are different control techniques based upon the age of the pipes, the type of minerals in the water, and it varies from city to city. You can't just step in with a one-size-fits-all operational plan to address the lead in the pipes. And so we are doing some groundbreaking research at some of our water facilities, in particular in Cincinnati and RTP in North Carolina. And it's really impressive, the work that our career scientists are doing.
That's great. So speaking of the career scientists, one of the issues that is facing a lot of the agencies, it's coming up in a lot of the utility world too, is this mass retirements. You're losing a lot of the EPA workforce just through retirements. How are you approaching staffing back up? Like, what's the plan?
We have about 40% of our workforce is eligible to retire over the next 5 years. I don't expect all of them to retire over the next 5 years, but they will over the next 10 years.
Yeah.
So we just hired a new human resources director. She started about 2 months ago. We'd gone a long time without a permanent human resources director. And I actually interviewed her before we offered her the job, because I knew I was going to hit her with a dozen things when she walked through the door. And I'm told the administrator doesn't typically interview people. It was 2 or 3 levels below the administrator, but I thought it was important to meet the person first before we offer the job to them. We have to deal with a number of issues. We have to deal with the people who are retiring to make sure that we're attracting new talent to the agency, but that we also don't lose the historic knowledge that they have. We also have to, on recruiting new people, and looking around the room, there are probably a few millennials in the audience. God bless them, but the people graduating from college today aren't expected to stay in the same job their entire career. And the history of the agency has been that people come to work at EPA and they stay 20, 30, 40 years. We still have, I think, 4 or 5 people who've been with the agency 49 years. We are celebrating our 50th anniversary next year. And I've told them all I'll give them recognition next year if they stay to the 50th anniversary. So I'm not going to name their names today. But we have a history of having people come work at the agency for their entire career, and we can't count on that going forward in the future. So we have a lot of human resources issues. I assume there's nobody here from OMB. I'm more concerned about attracting the right talent and making sure that we retain people instead of the FTE levels. I want to make sure that we're hiring new people, and we're having problems. Last year in the TSCA office, we have the new TSCA legislation that we're implementing, and we need to hire a lot of new chemists and toxicologists for that program. We hired 30 new scientists last year in that program. At the same time, we lost 30 people. It takes a very long time to bring on a federal worker into the workforce. It takes months with the OPM forms and everything, and the hiring process, identifying them, and so forth. And so we're just treading water. It took a lot to get 30 new people in that office last year, and we lost 30 at the same time. Some of them are retiring. Some of them are being snatched up by the private sector. But so if you want a job in our TSCA office, if you're commercial for that as well, send us your resume. But we're having a hard time getting the right talent in the door and keeping the people. But that is a high priority for me.
Oh, good, yeah. Well, and with TSCA, I mean, it took so long to get a reform even passed that now that it's in the implementation phase, yeah, that's okay. Well, because I know that, like I said, the workforce issues are significant among the various utility groups, and Congress just passed a WIA that had some water workforce funding in it to help build that constituency.
And there is a problem. I was just focusing on the EPA problem.
No, that's a bad one too.
It's a bad one, but you're right. Across the board, the water utilities across the country, there is. We really need to attract more people into that industry. There's going to be a lot of retirements just across the country, but they also need new people. They need new staffing levels, and how to pay for those and how to fund those is definitely an issue and a problem.
Well, so again, I just want to remind everyone, you have cards with you, write questions on them, and you can pass them to Carolyn.
I just want to make sure that Mr. Hergott does not write a question for me. But while we're waiting for that, I do want to put a plug in for the work he's doing. I think that's very important across the entire federal government to focus on the permits and to streamline them. And they took down the charts, but to go from that chart to that chart that were here a few minutes ago, it's a huge improvement.
It really is. And again, one that we at BBC have prioritized, again, because we've heard from those who want to invest in infrastructure that the political uncertainty is just too great for them. And one of our challenges, too, is in the water sector. People think P3 implies you're going to privatize the whole system, and there's different ways of doing that. And as I mentioned, you have your innovative finance office doing that. And it's exciting to hear that there's a P3 around desalinization.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a lot that we could do in that space, and so we look forward to working with you on that. So I thought I would open it up for questions from the crowd. Oh, we've got quite a few of them. Okay, great. Okay, so that was notes for me. It was not a question. I was getting instructions. So the National Climate Assessment identified significant vulnerability if the nation's water and infrastructure to climate change. Okay, how do you propose to address climate risk in EPA's infrastructure programs?
Well, I think we're doing that as we rebuild when we go into after hurricanes or tornadoes, when we're working with FEMA to make sure that we rebuild a resilient program that will withstand future storms. When I worked in Congress back in the late 90s, I worked on the Stafford Act reauthorization, and we included provisions in for FEMA as far as rebuilding after storms to make sure that the rebuilt infrastructure can withstand a stronger storm. I'm going to take the opportunity to just take a pot shot at the Green New Deal for a second, because it doesn't acknowledge the importance of a reliable grid. And when we go in as a first responder after a storm, after a hurricane, after a tornado, the first thing we have to do as a public health agency, which we are public health and the environment, is to make sure that the electric system is up and running in order to run the drinking water system. If the grid isn't back up and running, if we don't have the electricity, we can't run the drinking water system in the community, and we're providing bottled water for a long time. And there's been other climate legislation over the years that has valued grid reliability. But this latest effort doesn't give any credence to grid reliability, and that is so important. If Congress or anybody is debating legislation like that, they have to take into account grid reliability, because that is a public health issue, and that's something that we need when we go in as first responders.
No, that's really important, and I do think it's people, and I think in the public realm they do tend to focus on the electricity being down, but that means your water systems have gone down.
Exactly.
And which is a real crisis in some of these disasters. So let's see, if Congress passes an infrastructure this bill, would you like to see it include robust funding for water infrastructure?
I have to be careful, because I have to, I have a different hat now, and as an agency and part of the federal government, any recommendations for Congress on legislation has to go through OMB. But I believe, the president has talked about water infrastructure. We certainly, when he talks about infrastructure, he talks about it across the board. So yes, I'm not going to get into specifics on what we like to see, but water infrastructure absolutely has to be part of any infrastructure considered by Congress, in my opinion.
And so you are, not to put you on the spot, advocating for that within the discussions at the highest levels?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Well, that's good to hear. And I think I can speak for a number of people in the room, like we would love to be able to be an echo chamber for that. I think a lot of folks are concerned that we will end up with a highway reauthorization, which is important, but it's not everything. We do need water in there. Okay, so Carter Ingram from EY, can Administrator Wheeler comment on the administrator's view on using natural infrastructure to meet some of our infrastructure needs? Please. And then related to permitting challenges of natural infrastructure, the use of natural infrastructure to support revenue generation through fisheries, recreation, tourism, and supporting biodiversity.
Absolutely, I think it's important, and I believe we consider those, and going forward, for example, under the new WOTUS definition, we're looking at natural infrastructure like that as well. But yeah, absolutely, it is very important.
How the WOTUS rulemaking? What is the timeline for all of that? What's the plan? For those who that's Waters of the U.S.
Waters of the U.S. Yeah. And the comment period ended on tax day, April 15th.
Okay.
And I believe we're still counting the comments. We're going to have well over 1 million.
Wow.
Probably half of those are postcards.
Okay.
So it's easier to respond when you get 500,000 postcards, but if they all say the same thing. But we are going through those comments. We're working overtime on it, and our intention is to have the final WOTUS regulation out by the end of this calendar year.
Okay, great.
And I want to put a plug for that, because I think it's very important to provide certainty, because right now we have one set of regulations for 22 states, another set of regulations for 28 states. So we really have to move forward and get WOTUS, which is why we did not extend the comment period, for example.
Okay.
Because with that uncertainty that's out there in the country right now, with 2 different WOTUS definitions being used, we have to get the new definition out as quickly as possible.
Having worked on that issue for years, I would agree that as brilliant as the Clean Water Act is, not defining it was created a lot of problems later on. But anyway, okay, so BPC is participating in a National Petroleum Council study, and this is from Elizabeth Stolpe, who is a consultant to us.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Okay, yep. Is study on energy infrastructure. Secretary Perry has requested the study group look into resolving permit roadblocks for pipelines, rail trucks, etc. Is there anything you can share about how the agency is working to align State Clean Water Act authority with a well-functioning permitting process?
Thank you for the question. I'm going to answer it differently.
Okay.
Just because in the news this morning, where the governor of New York, vetoed another pipeline going through New York, it is, I believe, incredibly short-sighted to the environment to stop these pipeline projects. What happens is New England, in particular, ends up importing more natural gas, LNG, from other countries. Our LNG, our natural gas in this country is produced in a more environmentally conscious manner than anywhere else in the world. We have almost doubled the amount of natural gas and LNG since 2000, and at the same time, we have reduced our methane emissions 15%. Russia is not reducing their methane emissions, and they do not produce their natural gas in an environmentally conscious manner. Gazprom from Russia is the 3rd largest emitter of CO2 in the world, and you just put off the side transporting the natural gas from Russia or someplace else to New England, just shipping it over the oceans, the way that our natural gas is produced versus the way the Russian natural gas is produced, there's no comparison. And I think it's incredibly short-sighted to the environment to be vetoing those projects.
Okay. So this is kind of an interesting one that I had not heard of before. So this is from John Bird, the 3DEP Coalition. Enhanced elevation data collected primarily through LiDAR technology can be very helpful in planning, siting, permitting for infrastructure deployment and maintenance. The nationwide LiDAR program is run by the USGS. It's known as the 3D Evaluation Program, 3DEP, a best practices example of a federal partnership. To what extent is EPA leveraging the LiDAR data, and are you partnering with USGS at all?
I don't know.
Okay. I had not heard of that
I don't
either.
know who asked the question.
John Bird with the 3DEP Coalition.
John, if you could give your card to my staff in the back of the room, I will get back to you on an answer to that.
It sounds really promising, though.
It does. I'd like to
Okay.
know more about it.
It's like GIS. Okay.
Elevation data from LiDAR.
Okay, cool. All right. So you've been in Washington, D.C. for many years and seen up close the Hill and now in the executive branch regulatory reform efforts in response to our ever more bureaucratic government. What is your view on why these efforts consistently fail?
Is there another question?
Sure. Okay.
No, I mean, it's why the reform efforts?
Yeah, I think in the past we've seen efforts to rein in the regulations and the bureaucracy and streamline processes, and it just doesn't seem to take.
Yes, and if I started my career at EPA in '91, straight out of law school, and when I was at EPA the first time around, we tried to implement something called Total Quality Management, TQM. And that's more of a bottom-up approach for management reform. And then I went back to school and got my MBA, and when I was studying my MBA program, I studied the TQM process. I also studied the lean management system. And I thought at the time, TQM, it didn't really work at a federal agency. And studying it in business school, I saw why it wouldn't work at a federal agency, and I thought the lean management system seemed more promising. And so I was very excited to join the administration last year when the lean management systems are already underway. And actually, we credit the Obama administration. Gina McCarthy started it at a pilot scale at EPA. We've taken it to a much higher level now at the agency under our acting Deputy Administrator Henry Darwin, and we're seeing incredible progress. Like I mentioned at the beginning on the permits, the fact that we weren't tracking how long it takes to issue a permit. You can't improve a process unless you track how long it takes. We're seeing similar improvements across the board. Our SIP process, on average, we have turned one FIP into a SIP per month since March of 2017. One other quick example on the enforcement side, we have our large enforcement lab in Lakewood, Colorado. I think I got that right, Lakewood, Colorado. And they do the large enforcement inspections around the country. They were go out and inspect a facility, and it would take them, on average, 180 days to issue an inspection report. That meant 180 days without any environmental improvement taking place because they weren't identifying any problems. We put that through the lean management system, and we're getting those out in more of the 30-day range now. That's improving the environment, that's improving the processes, it's providing more certainty to the regulated community, and it's better for the environment. So I think efforts like the lean management system, which will improve the regulatory process as well as making us more customer focused, is going to provide more certainty to everyone, the public, the environment, regulated community, across the board. So I think efforts like that, I'm very encouraged by them.
Wow, okay. And I know you have got a very busy agenda ahead of you for the day, so I did want to just bring up our president, Jason Gourmet, who missed the beginning, but he wanted to make a few comments before you left.
You missed the beginning of my remarks, Jason?
But I had to, point of personal privilege, I had to crash the party to thank you, Andrew, for your service to the administration, but also we've been at this for maybe about 25 years together.
Yes.
And before he was Administrator Andrew Wheeler, this was Andy Wheeler, who was really a fixture at the Senate EPW committee, and always the person you had to talk to if you really wanted to move the process forward. And we've had a lot of real accomplishments together around infrastructure. I think the toxics issue, we haven't always been in the exact same place on the climate issue.
Eventually you come around to my side.
We're slowly moving. But I think something that everyone knows about the administrator is he's not just open to listening, but he's actually one of these people who's actually really interested in other people's points of view. And when it comes to making the democracy work better, I think fundamentally that is at the core of what BPC imagines the process should look like. And so I just want to thank you for what you're doing and for spending some time with us this morning. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Jason.
Yes, thank
Yeah,
you
thank
so
you,
much.
Michelle.
Yes. It was a real honor to have you here. I'm just thrilled for you.
I will come back anytime for you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And Jason.
And with that, we're going to do a little stage shifting, and then we'll get the panel up here. So, thank you.
Absolutely.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Thank you. Yeah, if you can just, yeah, go ahead. I know there's a lot of commotion, a lot of moving around, so thank you for bearing with us for a few more minutes. All right, as everyone settles a little bit. So just some shopkeeping while we're still gathering ourselves. Thank you all for joining us here in the room and on our webcast. You can follow this conversation online using the hashtag BPC Live. You can follow BPC on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And most importantly, you can follow me at Jake Varn. Again, I can see all of you pulling out your phones and clicking that follow button right now. Thank you. Appreciate it. We have an excellent panel here before you today to really dive into the water affordability questions. I want to set the stage a little bit that water as a utility has been historically underpriced, but also is unaffordable for far too many. And it is only a matter that's getting worse. I believe from 2000 to 2017, water prices grew by, I want to say 140%. Dramatically outpacing inflation, outpacing the cost of energy. It is getting increasingly more unaffordable. I believe the latest statistics is that about 11% of Americans their water bills are deemed unaffordable in that they take up too large of a percentage of their household income. And that percentage is expected to rise upwards of 40%. Or 35% in a very short period of time. As we'll dive into, there's a series of cost drivers and price pressures that are being put on water utilities that are driving up the cost of water. But I'll pause there to let our panel introduce themselves. We have a range of perspectives, so I think it would be really useful for our audience to just talk about really what kind of lens your work views of water affordability. And I'll start with you, Joe, at the end.
Okay, great. So Joe Veazey, I lead marketing at Xylem. I also lead our philanthropic and employee engagement program called Watermark. And then last, I sponsor our diversity and inclusion drive that we have at the company. Very important to us and something that we spend a lot of time on. For those who don't know Xylem, Xylem's a water technology company. We create economic and social value in the water space, where our passion lies. From an economic perspective, we essentially move, treat, test, and treat water, and we have technologies that do that. And that creates a ton of economic value. When you compare that to any next best alternative, we typically try to have a differentiated offering and therefore create economics in terms of CapEx or economics in terms of OpEx. We also create a lot of social value. Social value is very important to the company. We spend a lot of time on it as well. The very nature of what we do at Xylem is cleaning water and cleaning wastewater, and therefore we create social value from improving the society's standard of living, and we believe that's an important thing to focus on. In addition, employee volunteerism. We give back a lot of time to the communities to really help on water issues. That's a little bit about the company. We view affordability really through the technology lens, that if you can improve technology, you can really impact affordability in many communities around the world.
May, I'll turn to you next. You are intimately involved in the water space, coming off the Hill recently. Can you share with us a little bit about how you view water affordability issues?
Yeah, absolutely. So, May Stevens, I am Executive Vice President at Signal Group, which is a consulting firm here in DC. I like to tell people that I work on, people ask me, what do you do at a consulting firm? That seems like everything. And I like to say that I make the places that people live and work even better for them. So I'm very excited about that. I want to work on all infrastructure, environmental issues. So, and I get to do that every day, which is great. And so, I wanted to talk a little bit about what Congress has done previously on affordability and what they're, sort of going to do in the future. I think a lot of people in DC want to hear prognostication, so it's always exciting for me. So I think what have they done? And I will just say, part of the reason why Jake is asking me this is because I'm very new to Signal. It's only been a couple months since I've been there. Before that, I worked for Senator Cardin. I handled all of his environment and infrastructure portfolio, including water infrastructure, transportation, all sorts of stuff on the Environment and Public Works Committee. Senator Cardin is the ranking member for the Transportation Infrastructure Subcommittee, so I handled all of that work for him as well. So what are we doing on affordability and water infrastructure? A lot and not enough. I think a lot of people in outside of DC think that Congress doesn't do anything, but we're actually doing a ton of stuff. I wanted to brag to you a little bit about the things that we've been able to accomplish over the last just couple years, and in large part thanks to Alex Hergott and Ryan Jackson, who were here earlier this morning. We doubled the drinking water SRF. We've made WIFIA permanent and funded it, which is fantastic, and low interest loans are a great way to help with affordability issues, but nothing is better than grants. So we've gotten lead service line replacement grants, we've got lead testing in schools and daycare, grants for those small and disadvantaged community grants. We've got resiliency in drinking water systems. We did CSO, SSO, stormwater system grants. We've also done a ton on policy as well, and I got to work on all of these as well. So integrated planning, which has been huge for all of the utilities that are out there trying to deal with both wastewater and stormwater. Green infrastructure as well has been really big because it's sometimes less expensive, and if you can use it, then it's really helpful, especially for stormwater. And that was the other, sort of big highlight I wanted to mention is we created a stormwater funding and financing task force to look at how we are actually going to pay for all of this stuff in a way that it doesn't affect affordability. So we've done a lot, but we need to do a lot more. I'm happy to talk more about the prognostications later. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Last but not least, Matthew, you came all the way to us from Madison, Wisconsin. Can you tell us a little bit about both the mayor's innovation project that you work on and broadly your view of the water affordability crisis at the moment?
Absolutely. So with the Mayor's Innovation Project, and I promise we don't have a large PowerPoint. I don't like PowerPoints, but just to make some points, we're kind of generalists at the same time. We work with mayors and cities to do like what we like to call provide high road solutions. Sustainability, equity, and democracy is really what we center. So within that, we center water as a human right. Now, water utilities, they cost money to run, of course. So it's you can't just be like, here's water. It takes money, it takes rates, and as the infrastructure needs for cities, for water utilities, and we work primarily with publicly run water utilities since we work with mayors, they're going to have to increase rates as infrastructure needs go up. And it was previously mentioned, like these needs are constantly increasing, and a lot of cities are facing not just an affordability crisis, but also an infrastructure crisis. There are particularly small towns in the Delta region where levees are, it's a finger in the dam. And they are one major storm away from the town being wiped off the map, and they don't have the resources I mean, these are small towns. They just don't have the resources to do the repairs needed in really the time they actually need to do, because they needed to be done yesterday. Others, they just don't have. We're working with a small town out in Pennsylvania, post-industrial. Lots of issues with really the management of the city. New mayor comes in, wants to redo the management, and facing a lot of resistance. They don't have their water infrastructure mapped out. So we're working with them to help them map out like these basic things. Some didn't have meters, no meters, right? I mean, these are basic things that some cities are, well, of course we have water meters. Well, no water meters. How are you supposed to track what's needed to be done with no water meter? So we work with cities to do a lot of these things. And as previously mentioned, lead pipes are all across the country. My home state, Wisconsin, unfortunately, I'm also not a Bucks fan, so that doesn't really matter to me. It has major lead pipe issues. And even then, stormwater and wastewater infrastructure is going to cost about $271 billion to replace the stormwater and wastewater infrastructure, or really update it to the 21st century, particularly as the climate crisis is putting more and more strain on this stuff. And so we are working with cities on how to do this through a variety of different measures. Of course, increasing rates is part of that. Working with companies like Xylem or Mnet is part of that through efficiency. And then as they raise rates, we work with them on helping them develop, on making sure that it doesn't put anybody out. And what I mean by that is if somebody can't pay their water bill, the water utility isn't getting any money, right? So it's better to set up a program where they recoup some of that money, even if not necessarily all of it, but some of it, as they continue to move forward. We push, what we're really pushing is like the Philadelphia model, with an income-based rate program. Now, not every water utility can do that based upon state laws or utility district regulations. So we're working with, we're developing a paper right now on really what are the different options out there on cities based upon state legalities on how they can approach funding their water infrastructure while keeping affordability in mind. Look for that report a little bit later this year.
So sticking with you for a second, Matthew, I want to talk a little bit about this $2 trillion plan that's the headline of the day that no one really knows anything about yet, maybe, TBD. I guess the question is, as you mentioned, there are some systematic challenges that a lot of utilities face that obviously funding needs is a huge problem. Yeah. But I guess there is a question of if we're going to be increasing funding for it, if we're going to be pouring a lot of money into these systems, are we right now prepared to be building the best systems, or are there more asset management type improvements that we need to be making concurrently as we're also putting more funding into the system?
I'd say absolutely both. As what's hinted at, water utilities have historically been mismanaged in a lot of different ways, particularly public-only owned ones. A lot of times, not every single one. I want to shout out South Bend, Indiana, who has an amazing public works department and is plowing ahead with some very difficult tasks around their water infrastructure, CSO problems. They're under consent decree, and have done an amazing job plowing ahead with solving those problems. But some other water utilities is kind of where you've dumped off the unwanted civil servants of a city, and so there's been some mismanagement there. But others have been really well run. But there's a lot, again.
Good save.
Again, South Bend and East Bay, DC. But at the same time, you want to look for those efficiencies. Where can you improve? Whether it's sometimes it's as simple as replacing light bulbs to LEDs and automating lights, and reducing those costs through efficiency upgrades. Whether it's again replacing pumps and adjusting those aspects of it. But again, the major need though is in upgrading this infrastructure where there hasn't been major updates nationwide for drinking water going back into mid-century, for wastewater going back into the 70s. And again, as the climate crisis increases, and again, I'm from the Midwest, so I know all about floods. And we have these 100-year rains every 5 days now. it's putting a major strain on the stormwater and wastewater infrastructure. Even if it's not a CSO problem, it's putting a major strain even on some infrastructure that has been updated rather recently. And cities can't keep up with that alone. They need help from their states and from the federal government to do so.
Joe, I want to throw a similar question out to you. As systems are looking to implement new technologies and they're looking to gain efficiencies, what are some of the options that you are seeing? What are some of the best utilities that are leading the way on this?
Well, you know, when you think about the water industry, it's a massive industry. I mean, it's just massive. And I would say that it's filled with opportunities to drive productivity. That's how I would talk about it. And it's a complicated job. It's a hard job. And the folks working in this industry are really heroes. I mean, we have complete trust in this water, right? Complete trust in this water, and it was delivered by heroes here in D.C. And we have heroes all over the world who do this. But there is a lot of challenges that these folks work against. When you think about non-revenue water, so that's typically the amount of water that's lost from point A to point B. It's about $14–15 billion of lost product. If you went to any industry and said you're losing $15 billion that falls off the back of the truck when you're shipping your product from point A to point B, you would do something about it, right? Secondly is around energy. The water industry, specifically wastewater in the secondary tank of a treatment plant, is quite energy intensive. A lot of pumps out there. So when you think about 10% roughly of the global energy use comes from pumps. That's not all in the water industry, but it's in all industries from pumps. So pumps play a tremendous role from an energy perspective. Great, it's a great place to go and mine for productivity, for savings, to give back to ratepayers and to pass that on to drive affordability. We talked about combined sewer overflows as another option and challenge. And when you think about South Bend was mentioned earlier, when you think about South Bend, and Buffalo is in this case as well, where you have I would call it a traditional analog approach to working the combined sewer overflow challenge that in some cases might be $800 or $900 million. Now, if you consider alternative choices, I would say digital, deploying sensors to understand where can I best leverage the wastewater network that I have, that really is a massive storage network. It's a massive storage network. You have an acute problem in one area, but you have massive storage in other areas. So how can I divert that flow to other areas and then kind of have it seed into the plant when I need it? And that's really what happened in South Bend. Buffalo is deploying things like this. In South Bend's case, it saved them $500 million. Now that's about $10,000 per household. So when you think about affordability and you think about deploying new technology, you can really make a difference. I'll go back to pumping technology as a and a lot of different utilities are adopting a more energy efficient approach to driving productivity. There are certain pumping technologies out there that save 70%, or I should say they're 70% more efficient than traditional pumping. And when you think about the amount of energy it's used to pump water from point A to point B, it's a lot of energy that's used to pump water from point A to point B. Again, a massive amount of dollars that can be saved and either reinvested in the gap that we have today from an investment point of view or passed along to ratepayers to help on affordability. So there's a lot of different technologies out there that can really make a difference. And really, it's the industry's job to educate utilities about these different options and certainly educate the EPA and other stakeholders in this game as well.
As I mentioned at the top, there's several price pressures that are being placed on utilities that are driving up water bills. BPC has a great report, Safeguarding Water Affordability, that we released about a year and a half ago. It's up on our website for anyone that would like to bipartisanpolicy.org/infrastructure. But within those price pressures, one of the major ones is the effects of climate change. Another one is ratepayer, the change of the rate base, populations growing, shifting, and shrinking. And I think it is clear that the hardest hit areas by all of these pressures falls most on historically disadvantaged communities. They fall disproportionately on communities of color. They fall disproportionately on communities that have high concentrations of poverty. So may or anyone else on this panel, I want to open up this conversation a little bit as to how utilities can best target affordability programs and how they can best manage these price increases and some of the disparate effects that both affect their water bill but also their communities as a whole.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you hit the nail right on the head, right? This is an issue that affects utilities, large utilities, small utilities, urban, rural areas. I mean, poverty is not, only located in blue or red areas. So it's really an issue that affects all utilities in one way or another. And I think that's why you see a lot of the water, the last couple water utility or the water infrastructure bills being passed 97-3, 99-1 last year. So, I mean, really, people get it across the board. So I think there are a couple of things that, sort of any utility would benefit from. And these are some things that I think are sort of on the table and will be, really talked about a lot in the next 2 years as we go through the water infrastructure process. So one of these ideas is a LIHEAP, but for water. So it's
Can you explain what LIHEAP is a little
exactly,
bit?
Yes, acronyms all over DC. Yeah. So LIHEAP is a program in the energy sector that helps people who can't afford their electricity bills pay for those bills in the winter in New England and the summer in the Southeast to make sure that people are, are able to have the either air conditioning or heat that sustains them for those seasons. So this would be a bill that would be run exactly the same way, but it's for water utilities. And so the federal government would give out grants to utilities to then sort of forgive the debts of people who can't pay their water bills, thereby recouping the cost of the water that went out without having to burden people who wouldn't be able to pay for it. It might be all of the bill, it might be some of the bill, but there would be a lot of flexibility to the utilities to do whatever they need to do with it. It could also be water efficiency, appliances, all that kind of stuff. And I think that's really important. That was a bill that I helped write for Senator Cardin. It was a Cardin-Wicker bill. It was introduced. It was introduced in the House Fudge and CATCO last year. And so bipartisan effort on both sides of the House, I think, or both sides of Congress to make that happen. And another issue I think that would be really helpful is also for urban and rural communities that need this kind of help, or partnerships. We've talked a lot about how there are just so many water utilities in the country. A lot of them are serving a very small number of people. So when you have a $10 million problem in a utility that only serves 100 people, how are you going to get $10 million out of 100 people? It's very difficult to do that. So if you can get economies of scale by working together with utilities around you, then you can better help out those issues. And I think there are a lot of the sort of bigger utilities that serve more people, where it's just sort of a diversity of, you diversify your investments. It's the same kind of thing, where there are some people in a community that are very much able to pay their water bills, or some people that aren't. Let's, help each other make all of that happen. So that's another issue. And I want to just say that it could be both public or private, or a public-public partnership, a public-private partnership, and they would all be voluntary. It's just whatever could help the utility. I did want to tell a quick story about Scranton, Pennsylvania, because I think that this is a pretty fantastic story about a private water company, American Water, which I should say is one of my clients over at Signal. But it's a fantastic story. I think it's really illustrative of this point. So American Water was handling the drinking water system in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Scranton had a consent decree. They had a ton of maintenance issues that they were really, worried about. Scranton is losing population. It's a fantastic town. It's losing population, and it's really. It's really nervous about being able to do all of these upgrades. So they asked American Water to partner with them on the wastewater side as well. The upgrades were going to be about more than $1,000 a person if Scranton was going to be able to do these problems, deal with these problems themselves. But because American Water was able to step in and help them, they could spread the cost over all of their customers in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a pretty progressive state on these issues, so they were able to do it in Pennsylvania. You can't do that in every state. Don't get me started. I would love to change that. But they could spread it across all of their customers in Pennsylvania, so it was only a couple pennies per household in Pennsylvania, but it would have been thousands of dollars per household in Scranton. That's the kind of thing where you can see these partnerships really do work, and they really can make a difference on the affordability issue. I mean, now there's that affordability crisis it just got taken care of. And I think that's really important to think about, but I think that's not the only answer. That's why I think we need strong federal investment, LIHEAP for water, all the different things that we could be doing, so.
Matthew and Joe, I want to give you guys an opportunity to jump in on this too, and I'll add the extra question on top of it that a lot of extremely low income and low income Americans don't necessarily directly pay their water bill. I think nearly half just pay it through their rent, that it's incorporated in a rental cost. And so as water prices increasing, it's also now bleeding into the unaffordable or the affordable housing crisis similarly. So I'll open it up to both of you a little bit to dive in.
Maybe I'll just put a few thoughts out
Sure, yes.
that we have. And I love the Scranton story. My family's from Scranton, so anytime Scranton is mentioned, it always is has a special place in the heart. Because I can think about neighbors in the town that I used to go to visit my grandmom and my aunts and uncles, and it's a tough area to take that kind of bill. So it's great to see those things happening. One thing that, again, from a technology lens, and really from a business model perspective, I mean, when we think about different ways to offset cost, and I love this story, another way is, instead of having a cost all up front in terms of a CapEx, if you will, you buy something, you pay for that asset or item up front, how can I spread the cost over time? And so we try to offer different business models. One might be network as a service. So when you think about smart meters, we talked about meters here before, typically you would put up an advanced meter infrastructure system, and that's a heavy CapEx, a lot of cost up front, and then you deploy a lot of smart meters, which is additional cost. Now, what if you could take that investment and spread it out over time, essentially put the cost of the meter on the supplier's balance sheet, essentially, and have a pay-as-you-go over time. So for certain communities who can't afford the upfront costs, this is a way to still get the benefits that you need to provide safe water for the community or wastewater treatment, but do it in an affordable way. And so I think more companies need to embrace different business models, because customers are different, and one business model is not going to work for everybody. That's something that we're looking at, not only from network as a service or other heavy CapEx, but we'll do it on other technologies as well, and think about monetizing, if you will, over time. I think that can help.
Yeah. Matthew, I want to give you a chance to jump in
Yeah,
on
I
this
mean,
too.
I echo a lot of that, and particularly at the city and utility level, find ways to not just provide rebates, but really grants for low-income ratepayers, even if they're not ratepayers. I know Washington State has, again, state laws, which has the ability for cities and water utilities to basically, for those that are signed up for with a public electric utility or another public utility, would be able to kind of work weird crossway, and I'm not like super familiar with it, so I don't want to like speak too much about it. But a really interesting approach to being able to provide assistance for those and kind of almost rebates to ratepayers that are paying through their rent. And even though they may not have a direct account with the water utility, they might have they'll have an account with the electric utility or another way. And there's a lot of really interesting things that could be done. I'll say if you're a publicly owned utility and with a city and trying to identify low-income families, don't reinvent the wheel. We have organizations, we have initiatives that you have to be income verified, right? So partner with third parties. South Bend is again doing this. Again, South Bend, I'm not just trying to angle for a job for a former mayor there or anything like that. But they did a great job, thinking ahead of So let's not, as we think about needing to do income verification, we don't have to go out there and do outreach and spend money on outreach to verify anybody's income. We know there's places where we can find out who these people are. And so then it comes through, okay, then how do we provide assistance? And there's a variety of different ways in providing assistance, again, whether it's through rebates, through kind of upfront deductions on a bill, figuring out ways in working with landlords on providing ways to discount within rent and figuring out a way to make sure that those ways work down into their actual rent, so as the landlords who are paying, who have the actual account, you can set up ordinances and ways to work with them to filter down through that. There's a variety of innovative ways, but you have to break your silos. And I know that can be a bit tough in really any government agency, is breaking through those silos and finding partners, and there's always partners to work with, particularly, again, when we have all sorts of programs that have been elsewhere, particularly in the energy industry, that have already worked through providing benefits to low-income ratepayers. We can do the same with water.
So in our last few minutes, I want to preface this that we're going to be opening this up to some audience questions, so start thinking of some questions for our panelists. We'll have some mics going around. I'd be remiss if we don't spend the last minute at least talking a little bit about climate change, both in terms of the day-to-day operations and the exposures that utilities are being faced, and also the more devastating consequences of increased disasters. Are there communities that you all have worked with or been observing that are on the front lines of this, both in terms of the impacts, but also in terms of the mitigation and planning and trying to address these problems as they arise?
I want to give a shout out to Toledo. There's a community-based organization there called the Junction Coalition, and really in conjunction with the city government, they were able to, kind of the Junction neighborhood is a historically black neighborhood, right? That faces a lot of the problems of historically black neighborhoods. And they've been working with the city and are about to unveil a whole new plan as well around redevelopment. But one of the first things they did as kind of this coalition was with green infrastructure without displacement, green infrastructure as workforce development, specifically within that neighborhood. And green variety, not just around water, but just green infrastructure in general. And I think that's a really great approach, is with cities, with water utilities. Again, there are community organizations, even if they might not be water direct, that you can tap into, that have community-based resources that you can engage with, to then be able to engage your entire community around a lot of these redevelopments, particularly around green infrastructure.
May and Joe, any other thoughts on the impacts of climate change and how utilities are adapting to it?
Yeah, I mean, so I will just say I got to work a lot on this with Senator Cardin, creating the resiliency grants that I mentioned earlier. But what I will say is that I'm really familiar with the activities of the state of Maryland, and I think that the Chesapeake Bay is one of the wonders of the world, according to Senator Cardin, and everybody lives in Maryland, and it is beautiful. But it is also really, really susceptible to sea level rise. You're really close to the Atlantic, so there's hurricanes hit Maryland very much more frequently than I think people realize. And so I think that one of the things that I think that Maryland does really well is that they don't actually think separately about climate change. That's not an additional add-on, right? What they do is every step of the process when they're going through making any kind of infrastructure, they just sort of add that in to the the modeling of how long is this thing going to last, and what is the flooding going to be like when this, whatever it is, if it's a drinking water, wastewater plant, or if it's like a bridge or anything, how is that going to be affected in the future? And they're thinking about that during the process. And I think it's a way more effective way of making sure that you're dealing with these issues if it's just built into the process for all the infrastructure that you're building. And I think that's great. I know a lot of other states are doing that as well. I think Florida is doing a great job as well. They're they're one of the more in the headlines of the states that are being affected by climate change. But lots and lots of states are just building it into the model. I think that's the most important thing you can do.
Yeah, what I would say on climate change. First of all, it's really interesting to study climate change and the impact on the water cycle. You basically 90% of rain on the land comes from the ocean. And you essentially have warmer ocean, so you have more evaporation. Warmer air holds condensation, that process. Precipitation, it all comes at one time, and it comes so fast you don't have time for infiltration, and therefore you have flash flooding. And so it's a real kind of common sense approach as to how climate change impacts the water cycle and how that impacts, in one case, a lot of flooding. So we see a lot of folks, say on the East Coast from New York to Miami and others, who are putting in a lot of flood mitigation. How can technology continue to work under such circumstances? You have a lot of submersible pumping that continues to work during a flood. We see a lot of the deployment of analytics to understand where our flood water is coming. So we have an analytics business actually that works with a lot of these different utilities to understand the flow of water and where is water flowing and predict where it will go, and then have assets in place to remove it where you don't want it. And that's of course on one side of the climate challenge. The other side is where you don't have water at all. And so we see a lot of drought mitigation. We see a lot of reuse. This is more in the West and in Texas, Arizona. El Paso is putting a very large facility in place right now. And so we see a lot of reuse technology on that side, and those are some of the utilities that are leading the way there. But there are a lot of utilities in this space. And that last one I mentioned is EPR, direct potable, which is quite unique from an indirect potable perspective or general reuse perspective. So.
All right, I'd like to give us an opportunity to open it up for audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, just raise your hand. We'll have a mic going around.
Only softballs, right?
Only softballs, please. Yes.
Tracy Meehan with American Waterworks Association. Matthew, I'd like to invite you to our annual conference, ACE 19 in Denver, first week of June, where you can meet 12,000 of our heroes and explain to them how bad a job they're doing.
But no, many are doing a great job as well.
I think you need to disaggregate the data a bit. There's 51,000 community water systems and 16,000 wastewater systems. I'll bet you 400 of those systems serve 80% of the American population. So there really are problems with low-income people, distributional impact, but the doom and gloom hanging over this panel is really a distortion of reality, and I would associate with Joe's comments on that. But here's my question, end of speech. A couple of years ago, Congress mandated a study by the National Association of Public Administrators on affordability, specifically combined sewer overflow guidance on affordability going back to 1997, which only factored in wastewater, no regard for drinking water customers or stormwater customers, and they also pretty well trashed the concept of using median household income as a measure of affordability, which is common. The number of associations have tried to engage with EPA on this. I'm wondering if you're familiar with this report, if you have any thoughts, if not on the report, on those two issues. Because when you look at these average cost figures, they're really distorted by the combined sewer overflow consent decrees, which are hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. Milwaukee, in your state, medium, my wife's hometown, medium, mid-sized city, $4 billion for tanks and tunnels. And we can't afford to replace the lead service line. Love your comments on the Napa study.
No, I'm not familiar with the study, but to your points, we take a one water approach, right? So we're looking at the affordability beyond just drinking water, with inclusion of wastewater and stormwater, and then particularly with CSO, again in looking at South Bend and how they address and have been able to again reduce their costs through a lot of efficiency in working with MNET. But you're right. I don't want to be like too doom and gloom, but it is putting strain. And as these cities are going to have to invest in this infrastructure, particularly within my home state, within the Midwest, in dealing with increased flooding. It's gonna really impact these bills, and it's really about kind of getting ahead of the curve, and instead of waiting until really this critical mass, and better say it's like budding crisis, as it's been a while since the wastewater infrastructure has been updated, and stormwater, and a lot of CSO infrastructure that was created, and creating the CSO problems. So it's really getting ahead of it and thinking about beyond drinking water. A lot of places drinking water rates really aren't that high, but as they're going to need to make these infrastructure updates, how can municipalities, how can cities make sure that they have their 10-year, even 50-year plan and thinking about this infrastructure as climate change continues, and making sure that these systems aren't being overloaded in the future to increase flooding, and making these massive investments. Again, with South Bend, they've been, they're going to be a case study of ours, which is part of why I'm mentioning them so much. They had to create a stormwater utility, and they've created it out of thin air. And they started out with just putting a fee in, and it was like a $2 fee for households, which isn't a lot. But it doesn't fully pay the utility right now either. But they're going to build it out, again in mind with keeping things affordable. Their drinking water rates are low right now, but again, they have to increase those rates going forward. These things are kind of low right now, but they're going to have to increase these rates going forward. So whether it's through different types of programs, whether it's going to be an income-based rate program or discount rates, as they might look towards a conservation type of water rates, and all of it, and looking at other ways to help households and private businesses update their infrastructure as well. It has to happen, but it's something that has to be, cities have to get ahead of it right now. And some cities are facing a massive crisis, but like Milwaukee, a lot of this investment, we haven't done direct work with Milwaukee, but it takes a lot, and the money has to come from somewhere.
Joe, you've worked on this, or May as well. Yeah, you guys.
Oh, I was just
both
going to
covered these
ask
issues.
To tell one quick anecdote to maybe make Tracy feel a little bit better about the doom and gloom. So when I worked for Senator Cardin, so Senator Cardin has been an elected official for more than 50 years in the Maryland state legislature and in the federal government. So he was just up for a re-election in 2018, and obviously, if you've been around for that long, you've done a good enough job that they keep asking you to come back. So he's pretty safe in his re-election, but they still do. He basically does a poll every election year to justify the ads that he already kind of knows that he wants to run, because he's so good at this point. He knows what the ads are supposed to be. So they ran a poll, and they just decided to break out water infrastructure from Chesapeake Bay, and usually Chesapeake Bay extremely popular in Maryland. And so, but they decided to break it out a little bit because, it's been in the news a little bit more, and they thought maybe there'll be something interesting that we'll see out of this. And so one day, my chief of staff is talking to me outside of the congressional office building. I'm not allowed to know about this stuff if I like on campus, right? You have to do this off campus. He was talking to me off campus, and he said, I want to tell you something. You will not believe what the highest polling issue in Senator Cardin's campaign is this year. And I said, I just rolled my eyes and I said, what is the Chesapeake Bay? Like, stop it, right? Like, I know, like, I also work in the Chesapeake Bay, so I'm excited about that. But like, obviously Chesapeake Bay. No, water infrastructure. Water infrastructure pulled out from Chesapeake Bay that was also on the list. Water infrastructure, #1 polling issue in the state of Maryland in the last election, #1 reason that people wanted to vote for Senator Cardin. So I think that if the people outside of DC understand about this, care about this, and want to work on this, then I think the people inside DC, once they start doing those polls, and I would love for members of Congress to start polling specifically on water infrastructure issues, because I think they will be very surprised to see how important this is to people. I think that means that we will be very responsive here in DC, and we will get a lot more done as the years go on. So it's important. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe, and then we'll throw a question.
I'm not familiar with the study, but I'd like to follow up with you afterwards to learn more about it. I do think, though, that, at Xylem, we kind of coined that this is actually an opportunity of a lifetime. It's not doom and gloom. That this time, in no other time, has there been an emergence of technology to have a huge, meaningful difference, to create economics like have never been created before, to actually deploy those and positively impact the environment. And hopefully with the labor issue we talked about earlier, come in just in time to drive productivity when we need it because of the turnover in labor that you're going to see the next 5 years. It's an opportunity of a lifetime. That's where we're at. That's how we think about it. The other thing I would say is the power of communication. We're a big fan of George Hawkins. He used to be in town here running DC Water. George took pricing from about $40 or so to about $120. But George was an incredible communicator.
Not overnight.
Not overnight, over a long period of time, about 8, 10 years. But George was an incredible communicator, and we try to learn from others. And the learning here is connect with your communities. Explain what's going on. Explain the value of the investments that's happening. I think George was a hero to explain the investments that DC Water was making, how they were providing better services for the community, something that just wasn't done before. But it just involving the community and their water management is a big deal. We think George is a great case study for that.
Don't communicate when you have to, just communicate.
That's
right.
Yeah. Another question.
Despite the
Could you just tell us where you're
David Frenchie, S Resources. Despite the gloom and doom that's the reality of often low-income communities in post-disaster, there are tremendous bright spots out there, and I think those are being shown by the efforts of the League of Cities and NACO and NACWA, and also through programs to reach out to those that need assistance, such as Xylem is doing with Manchester City, and congratulations on Manchester City's victory. Maybe elaborate on what's happening on the global sense of reaching out to communities and investing.
Thanks for the question. About a year ago, we took a step back and said that the issue of water isn't breaking through. It's not making the headlines. Cape Town at that time, if you remember, was 10 days or 15 days until their day zero. If you go back to 2014, Sao Paulo was about the same time. The only difference was 20 million people would have been impacted in Sao Paulo's case, 4 million would have been impacted in Cape Town's case. And so we said, this issue of water isn't getting through. It's not making the headlines. And so what can we do? We think a leader in the industry should do that. That's the definition. You need to step up on behalf of the industry and get that message out there about water and the challenges around water and what we need to do about it. And so we took a look at a lot of different channels for us. This is uncharted territory, I can tell you, for our company. And we really went after first soccer. 40% of the world is involved in soccer. It's a massive number, and we wanted a global channel. The Premier League has about 3 billion people that tune into the Premier League to watch throughout the season. Give you a reference, about 1 billion people look at the NBA, so about 2 billion people look at UEFA's Champions League. So it's just in a league to their own in terms of reach. And it's very global. About 60% of the folks in Premier League are outside of the UK. And so when you get into the Premier League, you really just focus on the top 6 teams. We spoke to all of them. But, we connected with Manchester City. They had a big stake in co-creating messaging about water. They view the world, they want to change the world through football. We want to change the world through applying technology. And so our value systems matched. The messaging was there. They run, as an example, 6 social causes. They invest $500,000 in 6 social causes. One of those calls through our partnership will be water. And so the water issue, HIV, gender equality, and several other social issues went to vote for their fans as one example of what we've just done. And we'll all be happy to see that these are all great social issues that need to be invested in. But the issue of water doesn't break through. Our project, the water project, bringing clean water to 5,000 kids in Bangalore, came in number 1. It had over 450,000 votes out of 1.8 million people. And so we invested over $100,000 to bring clean water to those kids in Bangalore. We built water towers with our NGO partner, Planet Water, and we're doing a ton of other things. As an example, back to recycle. Manchester City just won the Premier League championship title on Sunday. It was, if anyone saw the game, they were down 1-0 during the game, and I was really on the edge. But we did a project earlier where we captured rainwater from the roof of Etihad Stadium where they play at home. We captured the rainwater. We then cleaned it through UV and ozone with our technology. We then sent it to Heineken, and we made beer with recycled water captured from the roof of the club's home stadium. It's called Reigning Champions because they are currently the reigning champions of Premier League, and we're getting a big push out of it. But again, the idea is how can we educate people about the positives of recycled water, right, to use in your daily life while using the platform that the club has to reach over 400 million people around the world. And so that's just a couple examples of what we're trying to do to get the water issue to break through like it hasn't before.
Well, I'm sure we're all very happy for Manchester City, and hopefully they forgive you for calling it soccer, and I'll forgive you for calling it football.
I have to know where I'm at, you know.
Thank you all for joining us. We've reached the end of our time. Thank you for all those who tuned in on the webcast. Please join me thanking our panel.